I will start getting up more actively on my YouTube channel. That's the goal. YouTube is very powerful, and I've been studying it, how it's been used and stuff. I'll probably have some different talk about that once I get up on actively up on YouTube. But it's a very powerful medium, and it's the first one I went uh, to solve this. So there's old videos of me in my Pasadena office uh, describing all the features of this pathology, like over a decade ago. So that's where I first turned. And once I got all the videos up on YouTube, then I felt comfortable that I could take the additional time to work out the pathology because everybody had the information if you needed it. It wasn't my fault for withholding information. It was your fault or the mental health people's fault for not applying the information. And I pretty much said the same thing now that I said, 10 years ago. That but the problem with this pathology is it's a motivational pathology. It's in the attachment networks, which are a motivational system. So there's no motivation in professional psychology to solve the pathology, and there's reasons for that. Um, but hopefully, I'll be getting up more actively on YouTube, and this is kind of the start of my inching over there is to put these coffee with Dr. Childress and see if those will be posted up there. You'll also notice, though, with my work that I'm heavily on Facebook Live and almost not at all on my blog. Now, previously, I've been doing a lot of blogging, but that's because the blog is for documentation of things, whereas Facebook Live is more actively stuff. So it more quickly enters the ether and doesn't stay around, but it's more day to day active stuff. So, and that's because my work has shifted to a degree. I'm no longer documenting all the problems like the flying monkeys and the ignorance and incompetence of the forensic psychologists and all those sorts of things. I already have those blogs waiting for me. So if I want to attack, um, child custody evaluations, I got 3 or 4 blogs on that. If I want to, talk about testimony in the court, I got a couple blogs on that. Whatever I need, I have the blogs I can bring forward to. Everything's documented. So now I'm more actively in the situation. And if you're not following me on Facebook Live or on Facebook, I don't know why, because this is where you're getting current actively information. And at this point, I'm in the family courts. So I'm not really worried about whether or not you're following me or what you're doing. I've got a different focus. I'll explain in a second. And so it's kind of up to you to initiate the solutions for your family. Um, I'll help where I can, but there's a lot of you and there's only one of me. And so if you can't access me directly, you're going to have to take leadership and get what you need because it's your children. And if you're lazy and you just use parental alienation as your idea and you're not, you're expecting people to rescue you, well, I'm going to not pay attention to you and we'll come back and pick you up after we've solved things. So I'm more working with those parents who are more actively involved and showing initiative in taking the solution into their hands. Um, but I'll be going on YouTube soon, hopefully, and keep improving the quality of that. One of the things about my background, just share personal, is I tend to be kind of a perfectionist. And so I've been working on that for 30 years, where I allow myself to be sloppy because I'm never sloppy. So, what I consider sloppy is just good quality work. But and so YouTube and that sort of, I want to get everything all perfect and get it. It's like relax, relax, relax. It's okay to go up and successive approximations of where I want to achieve. So let me start by just discussing our separate roles here, and I'll start with me because I'm the most important person in the universe to me. So we'll start with me. And my role right now is very defined and very limited scope. So I've given you all the knowledge that you need. I've told everybody what the pathology is. I've told you where to go for treatment, DBT and attachment, and I can apply behavioral analysis. I can expand more on treatment once we get people wanting the treatment. But right now we're in the diagnostic assessment, and I've explained everything 1,000 times to you. I'm just basically repeating everything about what's going on. So now I'm in the family courts as an expert consultant and testifying expert. Very dangerous for me. I'm reviewing forensic psychology reports, and I'm critical of them for a variety of reasons: ethical standards, absence of applied knowledge. And that's going to make me a lot of angry enemy people in forensic psychology. And you can see a board complaint out of Oregon is retaliation, in my view, uh, for my exposing the ignorance of the forensic psychologists in Oregon. So it's a very dangerous place for me. The licensing boards, staffed by forensic psychologists, are dangerous for me. If and The pathology is dangerous for me, um, and so that's why no clinical psychologists come here. But that's my role, which is the reason no clinical psychologists are with you or your allies is because they've abandoned you because of the professional danger of the family courts. And the reason it's professionally dangerous is the pathology makes it that way for that purpose. It drives away your allies by making it so dangerous for them to be here. So the solution is going to be to drive away the pathogen's allies by making it dangerous for the pathogen's allies to be here as well, the forensic psychologists and the ignorant and incompetent uh, mental health people. And so now it'll be dangerous for both sides. And so everybody will be here and everybody will abandon you. And then the courts don't have anybody and you don't have anybody, and it's a big mess. And the American Psychological Association will need to get in here to solve things. At which point I peg them with a petition to the APA and say, where were you back then? Why didn't you respond to parents? APA is part of the problem because they've abandoned you. Everybody's abandoned you, except the forensic psychologists who exploit you for your money. And that's the pathology. The pathology has created that. The pathology has motivation. The pathology created forensic psychologists. They created the Gardnerian PAS people. So the Gardnerian PAS experts are a symptom feature of the pathology. Gardner's PAS is the forensic psychologists and the custody evaluations they do are a symptom feature of the pathology. It's very interesting. No other pathology has motivation. ADHD doesn't have motivation. Autism doesn't have motivation. It's not autism isn't trying to be autism. It's not wanting to be autism. This trauma pathology wants to enact itself. And so the pathological parent has a motivation to enact the pathology, and it gets allies who also have a motivation from their own countertransference to enact the pathology. And so it has defenses. It defends itself. If you try to stop it, well, first off, it hides exceedingly well, so you can't identify it. Then it seeks allies to enact it. And so you have a bunch of allies that are supporting the pathology. And then if you try to expose it, it attacks with great viciousness to put you on the defensive. Because as long as you're defending, then the pressure's off of exposing it. So it attacks to put on the defensive. And no other pathology has defenses. That's incredible. And so there's so many incredible things about this pathology. Once we get real psychologists back looking at this, and I'll talk about that later, it's just phenomenal. And yet, there's no conversation, there's no professional discussion about any of the professional level issues involved because it's the pathology. It's keeping everything dumbed down to the lowest level, sub professional standards of practice. It is the worst professional standards of practice ever. I'm just trying to get them back up to the APA ethics code, just basic ethics code. Let's start there. Let's just get up to the APA, and then we can go higher from that point. But at least let's get out of basement, sub ethical professional practice. So my role right now is as an expert consultant in testimony in the family courts, reviewing a lot of times forensic custody evaluations, their mental health reports, and providing an opinion for the attorney in the court to move into that system. Now, when I do a review of a forensic evaluation, I have to go through it line by line. They're like 40, 50 pages long. And I go through with my first reading, I give a reaction from clinical psychology. And the reason I have to do line by line, two reasons. One is the ignorance is so dense that I have to do it. I can't even take it paragraph by paragraph. I have to address the ignorant statements line by line. In addition, the symptoms are reported. So I can draw out what the symptom is and put it into a pattern. So by the time I'm finished, I have all these symptoms arrayed in a pattern. Now, I can't make the diagnosis. Diagnosis is a pattern match of criteria to the symptoms. I can't do that because I didn't interview anybody, which prevents me from confirming the diagnosis. So that's what we do. We collect information, we identify the patterns, then we ask a few questions, confirm the diagnosis, and then we're solid. I can do the pattern match part. I can't do the confirmation part. That needs a clinical interview. So, so I can get you pretty close, but I can't get the ball over the goal line. Somebody has to do that there, or the judge. The judge can do a pattern match and decide there's a child protection response, that sort of thing. The other reason I have to go through line by line is because it's dangerous for me. This is an adversarial system. There's going to be cross-examination. Everybody's going to want to know why I came up with my opinions, and everybody fights about things. So I'm being very clear on the sources of information on which I relied for my opinions. And so that's why I have to go through it line by line to sort of end the fighting. And that's what we need to do in the family courts. We need to stop fighting around the child. That needs to stop. All mental health professionals need to stop fighting. If you got two different opinions from a doctor, one of them is right, one of them is incompetent. That's just a fact. And so if a doctor looks at test results and says you have cancer, and another doctor looks and says you have diabetes, one of them is right, one of them is incompetent. Okay. And so all doctors, all psychologists should be applying exactly the same information, the highest quality established knowledge from psychology. We should be applying the same information to reach the same conclusions and the same recommendations. If we're not, that's a problem in our world. That's a problem in the doctor world. And so the doctors need to stop fighting about the pathology. The reason we're fighting is because it's called a parallel process of staff splitting. That's what Linehan calls it, where the doctors start fighting about the patient. And it's a manifestation of the splitting pathology within narcissistic and borderline personalities. So I know that. But forensic psychologists, all these psychologists that work in the family courts don't even know about parallel process staff splitting around borderline pathology. So everybody's arguing about stuff. Legal system facilitates that. It's an adversarial system. And so the psychologists, we need to bring this fighting to a close. The way we do that is all get on the same page, using the same language, the same knowledge. Now, the Gardnerian PAS people want that to be Gardner's model of PAS from the 1980s. Professional psychology has said, no, I've looked at those symptoms. They are the worst imaginable. I say no to parental alienation syndrome. Don't use that one. No, it's awful, awful, awful. No, I agree with the American Psychiatric Association. No. Now, that doesn't mean the pathology doesn't exist. It does. Let's use established knowledge and established constructs that have a lot of research based to them that will lead to a treatment model instead of creating a whole new pathology when we don't need it. I saw a little post flyer come through about some movement in Australia of somebody wanting to get parental alienation behaviors identified as child abuse. Why? If you just a shared persecutory delusion is child psychological abuse. You already have it. Just switch to using a shared persecutory delusion as your construct rather than parental alienation, and you have it right now, today, February 19th, 2023. You have that the pathology is child abuse if you just use the real terms. They don't. They're locked into this parental alienation thing from their own needs. And so it just continues no solution because there's no way to diagnostically define parental alienation. Give you an example. I was reviewing a custody evaluation. The custody evaluator, stupid, ignorant, no knowledge applied, but the pathology is clearly present. I'm reviewing that, documenting everything. And when they reach their conclusions, their ignorant conclusions, they cite Burnett and Demosthenes Lorandos. They cite their article about five-factor PAS to say there was no parental alienation. And that's what I see all the time. If you use the word parental alienation, they'll just say, oh, we looked at parental alienation and there was none. And what can you do to fight back on that? You can't, because that's just an opinion. There's no diagnostic criteria that's any established. If they say there's no persecutory delusion, now you can say, well, would you think it's true then? Well, no, it's their belief that they're being malevolently treated is not true, but it's what the child believes. Well, that's a persecutory delusion, isn't it? If it's not true, it's false. And then how false? And you can use a mental status exam. Mental status exam. The reason I put that in, because that's the final hammer on these mental health people, because the differential diagnosis is a potential persecutory delusion. And so that requires a risk assessment. Either it's going to be child abuse by one parent, targeted parent, or child's psychological abuse, shared persecutory delusion by the other. Now, the assessment for a shared persecutory delusion is a mental status exam of thought and perception. But I know none of these mental health people in the family courts know how to do that, because the only people know how to do that are over in schizophrenia, and they're not working the family courts. So I know that. So I know for a fact that they are all practicing beyond the boundaries of their competence, all of them. Now, if they're going to argue with me about that, well, then conduct a mental status exam of thought and perception. If they don't say, well, we don't know how to do that, then they have a choice. They can either learn how to do that, go away, learn how to do that, and come back, according to standard 2.01A, or 2.01C and D says they should be consulting. Who should they consult with? Me. I've got that background. I've got attachment background. They don't have attachment background. I have factitious disorder imposed on another. I have child abuse and complex trauma, and I have 10 years in the family courts. So I have that professional background in delusional thought disorders. What I would tell them to do is not the mental status exam. Yes, if they can, but there's 3 diagnostic indicators: collect, checklist, check, check, check. Are these 3 present? And 12 associated clinical signs. If you gather those symptom information, then you can make the diagnosis based on those symptoms. So I'm kind of scaffolding them up. But if they don't want to listen to me, well, then do a mental status exam of thought and perception. But you need to do a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse when the differential is child abuse. And so but we can get to the mental status exam and that leverage if we use a persecutory delusion as our construct. If we use parental alienation as a construct, you lose it. You lose any accountability and any ability to hold the professional accountable. And so the use of the word parental alienation needs to stop. It degrades the quality of mental health services being received by family. And it's a completely failed diagnostic model, 40 years since 1980s. It's given us this ignorance and incompetence and unethical practice. This is the product. What you're seeing is the product of trying to use this new pathology of parental alienation. So don't do that. But if you do, you're on your own, because the rest of us are going to be moving towards more established constructs. So let's talk about that for a second. So I'm over in the family courts, kind of pounding the mental health people, because once we create a situation where it becomes dangerous for ignorance, then the ignorance will take a risk management response, which is what we want. The whole difficulty in the mental health system, the reason it's broken is because the mental health system, us as psychologists, took a risk management response to the dangerousness of the pathology by creating your own special psychologists, forensic psychologists, which then allowed clinical psychologists to abandon you, hoping that the forensic psychologist would take care of you, and we just kind of shunted you off to them. But instead of taking care of you, they've simply exploited you financially. And there's reasons for that. The quality of people that come into the family courts is really low. They get kind of caught up in their narcissism and went off the rails. So the forensic psychologists are financially exploiting you. They're ignorant, incompetent, and unethical. I will debate that with any forensic psychologist at any time in any forum. Set it up. And I will debate the role of forensic and clinical psychology in the family courts. So I will support my statements that they are ignorant, incompetent, unethical, and are exploiting the parents in the family courts, financially exploiting them. So that's where I'm at, looking at making it difficult for my professional colleagues and improving the standard of practice that they are that you are receiving. Now, on your end, as a parent, that's not your role. You're not actually, your role isn't in the court system. Now, you think it might be because you think you have to prove a pathology to a judge to get the proper orders. No, you don't. You have to get an accurate diagnosis of the pathology so you can get a treatment plan to fix it. And the accurate diagnosis is the shared delusional disorder and child psychological abuse. And the treatment for psychological child abuse is a safety plan to protect the child. That's a protective separation where you restore the child's healthy development. So we start with the diagnosis to lead to the treatment plan, and the treatment plan is for child abuse. Okay, so it's a step-by-step process. So what you need is a clinical diagnostic risk assessment for possible child abuse. And in all cases of possible child abuse, physical, sexual, neglect, or psychological, there should be a proper risk assessment conducted. That's for all dangerous pathologies: suicide, homicide, and abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, elder abuse. For any risk pathology, we should conduct a proper risk assessment for child abuse or for spousal abuse or for suicide or whatever the risk is. That's standard of practice, duty to protect obligations. So that's what we need. And the differential diagnosis in the family courts for severe attachment pathology, when a child's rejecting a parent, severe attachment pathology, the differential diagnosis is child abuse. Either it's child abuse by the targeted rejected parent who is creating the pathology in the child. That's a two-person attribution of causality. Or it's psychological child abuse by the allied parent who's creating a shared persecutory delusion and false attachment pathology in the child for the secondary gain of meeting the parent's own needs and to manipulate the court's decisions on custody. So it's going to be child abuse one way or the other. We just need a proper risk assessment in all cases. So where I'm headed is that we should sort of routinely bump these cases out of the family courts over to get a diagnostic risk assessment. Take about 4 to 6 weeks, return to diagnosis. I'm recommending we get a second opinion on those and structure it up very cleanly so we stop fighting, identify the child abuse early, and solve it early before we let it get out of control with all these lengthy, court battles and kind of stuff. The pathology wants to drive the solution or the failed solution into the family courts because it wants to put you on trial for being a bad parent, bad spouse, and wants to make it as hard as possible for you to see your child. So that's the family courts, expensive, and just make it as hard as possible. So the pathology wants to drive it into the family courts. If you're thinking the solution is in the family courts, you're captivated by the pathology. No, it's not. You want to move this into the healthcare system. You want to move it into treatment. And when you start to advocate for treatment, that puts the pathology in a position that has to argue against treatment, and that will expose it. So it wants to drive this into the courts, make it about custody. You want to drive this into the healthcare system and make it about treatment. So your role is over with the psychologists and the treatment providers. So you need a treatment plan to fix things. These words mean exactly the same thing. Diagnosis means exactly the same thing as identify. Um, Pathology means problem. Treatment means fix it. We must first diagnose what the pathology is before we know how to treat it. We must first identify what the problem is before we know how to fix it. So you can use all those words interchangeably. If you want to make a common sense point, use common sense words. If you want to make a technical point, use the technical words. But diagnosis guides treatment. You have a problem. It's an attachment problem. It's a problem in the love and bonding system of the brain. And the child has an attachment pathology, has an attachment problem. You need to fix it. This child's brain is developing its patterns for love and bonding called internal working models that will guide it throughout the rest of the lifespan during childhood. So we don't want severe attachment pathology during childhood. We need to fix it. Now, the pathology is going to argue the way to fix it is by eliminating a parent. No, that is attachment pathology. The way we fix it is by fixing it. Okay, so we need a treatment plan to fix it. That's what you need. And to get a treatment plan, we're going to need to identify what the problem is. We're going to need to diagnose what the pathology is so that we know are we treating autism? Are we treating ADHD? Are we treating cancer, diabetes? What are we treating? We need to diagnose the problem. The concern is we might have child abuse by the targeted parent, two-person attribution of causality. So let's take a look at that. Is the targeted parent abusing the child, creating the child's attachment pathology? Or is it psychological child abuse by the allied parent, which is a three-person attribution of causality, a triangle, who's creating a shared persecutory delusion and false attachment pathology in the child? Okay. So what I'm working on in the family courts is to educate the court system and the legal system, as well as challenge the current ignorance in psychology, but to educate the court system regarding clinical diagnostic assessment of pathology so that when we have these cases entering the family courts, if the court makes a custody decision the first time, all normal range people are able to accommodate themselves and regulate themselves to court orders. So if it's every other weekend, they don't like it, but they deal with it because that's the court orders. If it's coming back because high conflict and they somehow can't manage the court orders for custody for whatever reason, and we're looking at attachment pathology in the child towards a parent, and the child saying, I don't want to be with that parent, and it's all kind of a mess, get it out to get a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse. Is a targeted parent abusing the child, or is the allied parent psychologically abusing the child? Courts and attorneys are not trained in the diagnosis of pathology. That's doctors. So get it out to a doctor and let's get a proper risk assessment on that. Now, you're facing a problem. Patients should never, ever, ever have to explain a pathology to a doctor. That should never, ever, ever happen, where a patient has to explain to the doctor what the pathology is. That's insane. That shows the level of ignorance and incompetence in the professionals surrounding you, that you have to explain to them what the pathology is. But you do, because they are so incredibly ignorant, lazy, unethical, incompetent, that the patient has to explain to them what the pathology is. Now, when you do that, you will create a narcissistic injury in them, because they are low level mental health people. And so they bring in their own countertransference, and they're going to retaliate against you for exposing their ignorance and inadequacy. So you be careful. The mental health people around you are dangerous to you. They will use their power with the courts to harm you if you do not do what they want you to do. That should never, ever, ever happen. I mean, the level of professional quality over here is phenomenally beneath everything. So patients should never be threatened or in danger from their doctors for retaliating against the patient for wanting competence. Phew. But it happens in the family courts. That's the current state of the situation. So just be aware of that. And you're going to have to sort of be kind. Be kind. Don't be assertive, because that'll get pushback and get you into trouble. You have to be kind of a little clever like a fox, and draw them into things. You put the weight of the challenge onto me and let me kind of carry that, and you keep your head under the water. But there'll be some controversy around me for a little while until it calms down. And so we have different paths, you and I. So I'm working in the family courts, very specific, very focused, but I can only work a few people at a time. I took January and February off from seeing public consults, because I had to get caught up on some of my report writing and some of my testimony. So when I do a report, I go through line by line, takes me days, and then generate my report on things. But then it can be, a couple of months before I testify about my report, which is another reason I do the line by line notes, is I can review myself and know exactly why I came up with the information. And the notes go in as appendix, so the court can also look at why I came up with my decisions or my opinions. And so, uh, I've taken January, February because I had a lot of testimonies coming up, and testimony, oh my God, it's so stressful for me. I do not like testimony, because if I make a wrong sentence or a wrong word choice, I could face sanctions on my license, because the pathology is going to file a licensing board complaint, and it's all documented on the test. It's dangerous to work for you, to try to help you. It is dangerous for me. I have to put my license on the line trying to help you. That shouldn't happen. Psychologists who come in to work with your families and solve things and treat the pathology should not should not have to put their license at risk. They don't have to put your license at risk in ADHD. You don't have to do it in autism. You don't have to do it in substance abuse. In none of the other pathologies does the doctor need to put their license at risk just to enter the field. Over here in the family courts, they do. And that's why you don't have any treatment providers. There's no treatment over here because all the clinical psychologists haven't been here for 40 years. So we're going to need to get dialectic behavior therapy over here, DBT. Why hasn't it been brought over here yet? And we're going to have to adapt it for this court pathology. It's a treatment of borderline, but this is a treatment of the consequences of borderline in the family. So it takes a little bit of adaptation, because we're treating family issues and attachment issues. Why hasn't that been done? Because there's no motivation from the clinical psychologist to do that. All the DBT therapists from 30 years, none of them have come work in the family courts. They've adapted DBT to substance abuse. They've adapted DBT to other trauma pathologies, but they haven't brought it to the family courts. I was taking a seminar with Bessel van der Kolk and his group uh, that he's developed regarding complex trauma. I recommend people take that. But I'm sitting there listening. Bessel doesn't work in the family courts, and none of the people who were presenting work in the family courts. So you have top experts, but they're not over here in the family courts. Why not? Because you've been abandoned. It's too professionally dangerous. We have the lowest level of people. Instead of Bessel van der Kolk being the expert in the family courts, we got like, master's level PAS experts. Instead of getting a high quality attachment person over in England, you got Peter Fonagy, you got the Tavistock Center. Why aren't they involved in the family courts? They just they don't touch it. You've been abandoned. It has to do with sex abuse pathology. Now you know what that little sex abuse kid feels like. You've been abandoned. Nobody comes, nobody helps. Nobody sees you, nobody hears you. Even if you say, they don't believe you. And so it's a ripple, and you're carrying the trauma of that. It's called, again, parallel process. So professional psychology really needs to self-reflect on this issue, and we need to kind of look at how we dealt with risk management. It was a failed approach. It was a very bad approach. Doctors should never hurt people. Never, ever. That's not, doctors do not hurt people. We fix things. We're treatment. But if we're making custody decisions about where the child should be, that's, if we restrict either parents in the absence of child abuse, if we restrict either parent's time and involvement with the child, we're damaging the child's attachment bond to that parent, thereby harming the child and harming that parent. Doctors are not allowed to harm people, so doctors should stay away from custody decisions. There's two options for custody: basically 50-50, or every other weekend and a night during the week. There's your two options. You do a little variance. It's not difficult to make a custody decision. What's difficult is when there's attachment pathology and a child's rejecting a parent and there might be child abuse. Now it becomes more complicated for the court. Let's get a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse on a routine basis, and then the court can make its decisions based on the diagnosis being returned from psychology. And since it's going to be in the family courts and it's adversarial, let's get a second opinion right up front. So we can do that through telehealth. So we get somebody in the room making the diagnosis. We get a second opinion on telehealth to confirm the diagnosis. If opposing counsel wants to add a third psychologist, we get a third one on telehealth, and we get a panel of psychologists to return the diagnosis. Then the court can rely on that diagnosis, and we can stop the fighting and initiate a treatment plan. And within 3 to 6 months, the treatment plan should fix everything. Otherwise, we've either misdiagnosed the pathology or we're incompetent in our treatments. That's another thing to explain or to identify right now, which is, if treatment doesn't work, and I'm thinking 12 weeks, you want significant progress. 6 weeks, you want significant progress. But by 12 weeks, you're looking at seeing substantial movement on things, depending on the diagnosis. But if you're not seeing that in terms of treatment, there is one of two explanations. It's either one thing or the other thing. There's only two explanations for treatment not being effective. One, you've misdiagnosed the pathology. So you're treating cancer with insulin. If you treat cancer with insulin, the cancer doesn't get treated. And so it's ineffective treatment. So one possibility is you've misdiagnosed the pathology. The second possibility is the diagnosis is accurate, but you're incompetent. You cannot successfully treat the pathology. You're incompetent in applying the treatment for the pathology. Because if your diagnosis is accurate and you're competent in the treatment, then things should be fixed. So if there's 6 weeks and there's no movement, I'm going to start thinking, did I misdiagnose the pathology, or is this the right treatment? Or do I know the treatment? And since I know the treatment, I more likely misdiagnosed the pathology. And so that's the issue around treatment. So you're going to want to move over to the mental health people. You're going to want a clinical diagnostic risk assessment for possible child abuse. You won't find that available from the mental health people. And when you ask people who are competent in mental health, If they will do the assessment, they will say, oh, no, you're a custody conflict case. I don't work with those. So they're going to say, well, you need a forensic psychology custody evaluation. You need a forensic custody. And you say, no, I don't want one of those. I want a clinical diagnostic assessment, not a forensic custody evaluation. One reason is it takes 6 to 9 months to complete a forensic custody evaluation, and this is possible child abuse. We need an answer more quickly. Second, forensic custody evaluations do not return a diagnosis, and we need a diagnosis. Third, this isn't a custody question. This is a diagnostic question about child abuse. So we don't need the answer on custody. We need an answer on pathology. And another related decision is that it's going to cost you about $20,000 to $40,000 for a forensic custody evaluation for 6 to 9 months, and it'll likely cost you in the neighborhood of around $2,500, $2,000, $2,500 in 4 to 6 weeks for a clinical diagnostic assessment. So you want a clinical diagnostic risk assessment for possible child abuse. You won't be able to find one of those. What do? I'd recommend you start looking among the DBT therapists, dialectic behavior therapists, the ones who are trained to work with borderline personalities. So the ones who've been working with Marshall Linehan, you'll see it on Vitas or something. They've received training in dialectic behavior therapy for a couple of reasons. One, they're working with borderline personality pathology and suicidality in that. So they're not timid therapists. If you're working with suicidality, there's a level of courage to you as a therapist. So they will have that level of courage, and they're trauma psychologists, because if you're working with borderline, that's transgenerational trauma. And so and has all the trauma features of escalations and chaos and all sorts of stuff. So they are tough psychologists. The reason I don't send you to the attachment psychologists is they're wonderful. They'd be wonderful with the kids' attachment pathology towards you, but they're too soft. They can't deal. They're not strong enough to deal with the narcissistic borderline pathology. You need somebody who's got trauma background to deal with that, and that's your DBT therapist. And it's very structured. Plus, you get a baseline of knowledge when you turn to DBT, which is applied behavioral analysis, ABA, applied behavioral analysis, behavioral psychology, applied behavioral analysis will be able to identify whether or not the conflict is authentic. It will look at the cue for the child's behavior, and there's no cue there. And so if there's no cue for the behavior, stimulus response, then what's cueing the behavior? Oh, that's the other parent. It's the alliance with the other parent that's cueing the behavior, the function that the behavior serves. So when you go to find a DBT therapist, they will know applied behavioral analysis. So you will already have a baseline of at least some competence that we can build on. But they will need to adapt DBT to the family courts, because it's a family pathology and they're actually looking at the attachment pathology with the child. So they're going to have to bring in some attachment information as well, rather than just the behavioral approach. The other nice thing about DBT therapists is they add mindfulness as a skill set. And that's going to be very helpful to the child in terms of reducing stress in the family and in helping the child develop self-authenticity. The other feature, cognitive behavioral therapy, is sort of the basis of DBT, and the cognitive therapy component of challenging irrational beliefs would be helpful with delusional disorder. So the model needs to be adapted, but it's the one to bring over. And the DBT therapists are the ones to bring over as our first line of people returning. They won't want to come to the family courts because it's too dangerous, and they don't work in the family courts, and testifying and stuff. It's stressful and dangerous. That's where consultation with me, or I could help scaffold them up on that domain of working in the family courts if they're concerned about that. But what they'll want to do is they will likely be okay returning to the family courts if they can bring DBT with them. So that structure, they just do DBT in the family courts, that they'll say, yeah, I can maintain safety in the family courts if I just am in this role. And you reassure them it's not about custody. No, no, no. We're not talking, we're talking treatment. And we need a diagnosis of possible narcissistic and borderline pathology, creating the persecutory delusion in the child. And so it's the persecutory delusion that we are looking at specifically diagnostically, but it's secondary to a narcissistic borderline dark personality parent. And you'll see in my writings, I'm putting narcissistic hyphen borderline hyphen dark personalities. It's a constellation, so it's dark triad, dark tetrad, vulnerable dark triad. In my earlier writings, I was putting narcissistic slash borderline in parentheses because it's primarily narcissistic, but we got a borderline core to it and things. So I've adjusted now how I'm expressing the pathology. It's narcissistic hyphen borderline hyphen dark personality. So it's that spectrum of personality pathology we have in the family courts. And so as you explain it to DBT therapists, you can talk a little bit more about the personality pathology that's potentially present. Don't ever assert things. You stay an ignorant consumer of mental health services, but you need to get knowledgeable. You need to be an immensely knowledgeable consumer of mental health services because it's too important. You can't trust the current ignorance there. I wish you could. That's where we're headed 5 years from now. Hopefully the new parents coming into new divorce situations won't even have to know what the pathology is. The professionals just take care of everything. That's the goal. The professionals know what it is, and the professionals take care of the parents who are coming into the situation. That's not where we're at now. They're exploiting you. The mental health people are just simply taking your money, solving nothing, and have abandoned you, and it's just a nightmare. So right now, you need to be an informed consumer of mental health services. And be kind, be nice. You also have to kind of manipulate the mental health people because they're going to retaliate against you if you don't appease their narcissistic grandiosity. You won't need to do that with a DBT therapist. When you're working with a DBT therapist, they're professional, and so you won't need to manipulate them or anything like that. All mental health professionals respond more to anxiety and sadness than they do to assertion. So don't try to tell your doctor, but help lead your doctor into things. But present your vulnerability, present your love, present your fears for the family, your fears, your concerns for the child, and ask them to solve things and get them on your side as an ally. So as you seek clinical diagnostic assessments, stop seeking forensic custody evaluations. That will dry up all the money in custody evaluations. So you got a bunch of custody evaluators who aren't making money because there's no demand. But there is demand for clinical diagnostic assessments where they can make money. Guess what? Supply follows demand. So, they'll follow the money. Now the forensic ones are ignorant like a rock, but at least we got somebody over there that's used to the court system. And if they start diagnosing shared delusions, yay, happy, happy, happy. And so they will follow the money. That's why I keep saying you are more powerful than you know. You have money. They want your money. Right now, they've only given you one option. That was the issue. They just said the only option you have is a forensic psychologist. I came along and gave you a second option from clinical psychologists. See, I'm not an idiot. I gave you a choice. And that's what all of my work is. Look at all my work. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've given you a clinical psychology solution. Now you have a choice. Now you can go into the court and say, I want this clinical diagnostic assessment. You don't want a forensic evaluation. The money dries up. The money shows up over here. We're all of a sudden getting what you need. So you're the demand side of supply and demand. They're the supply side of supply and demand. Start demanding professional competence before you give them your money. and you will start getting professional competence because they want your money. But if you just give them your money for ignorance and incompetence, they're going to be ignorant and incompetent because you're giving them their money for that. So you're demanding that. So elevate your demands. Be nice, be sweet, be knowledgeable about what you want. Elevate your demands up to where what you have the right to expect. That's why I've educated you about the APA Ethics Code, 2.04, 2.01, 9.01. Those are codified in the APA Ethics Code. Those are your rights. You have the right that they apply established knowledge. You have the right that that they are competent in the pathology they're working with, which means delusional thought disorders and attachment pathology. They're not. So you can look at their Vita. And so that's an issue. 2.01 C and D is where you need to look. They need to be consulting. If they're not competent, C and D, they need, but they're still working with the pathology, they need to be consulting or getting educated, getting competent somehow. But you have the right to have competent doctors. They need to know what they're doing. Practice beyond the boundaries of competence is unethical and it's malpractice. So, um, running out of time, but I also want to talk about the fact that you parents have no support, no professional support here. So, over in ADHD, when I was working down there with Jim Swanson, um, they have a parent organization, CHADD, CHADD, strong parent professional organization to advocate for them. And it's a cooperation thing between the parents and the professionals. So Jim Swanson's lab and his people were working closely with Chad in Orange County to get the services the kids need. The professionals and the parents have a strong organization. Over in autism, they have Autism Speaks and a number of autism agencies. But again, the professionals and the parents are working in close collaboration. Over here, we have nothing. There's no professional support. The professional support you have is the Gardnerian PAS people who are like ignorant like a rock. They're not helpful and they're not supporting you. They're insisting that you use parental alienation from the 1980s that solves nothing and will just drive you into no solution. It will drive you into the family's destruction. For parental alienation, there's no diagnosis for it, so you have to prove it to a court. So it's supporting the pathology wants to drive you into the legal system. The Gardner PAS people want to drive you into the legal system because they're allies of the pathology. And that's be my talk coming in the future is talking about how the pathology created both the forensic people, psychologists, and your own special psychologist, and the Gardner PAS people, the loyal opposition to dissipate your energy into non-productive fighting back. We need to get you over to where you're fighting back in an effective way, not just dissipating it out into this awful, awful construct of parental alienation. So, and I've seen parent organizations try to develop. The issue is, though, you're not getting any professional support into that. You say, "Oh, we have like the parental alienation study group." No, I sat with Bill Burnett, in Venice, across the table. Dorsey Prude is sitting right there, and he said, "No, I'm not going to support uh, the return to established knowledge." I offered to write articles together and to come together, and he said, "Nope, it has to be parental alienation or nothing." And I said, "I can't do that." And I said, "Well, at least then allow the parental alienation study group to come over and start advocating for with the APA about established knowledge." And he said, "No." This is what he told me. He told me the parental alienation study group is not an advocacy group. It's only to study parental alienation. I remember because it just stunned me. What do you mean it's not an advocacy group? You're just studying what? It's just it's just so you don't have any professionals over here, professional organizations. What I suggest you do, all you parents, join NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. It's a families of mental illness. A lot of them are schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, spectrum issues, autism to some degree. But schizophrenia is good, well represented. Join it. You have a delusional disorder in your family, a persecutory delusion around narcissistic borderline. You have unresolved trauma. That's how you describe the narcissistic borderline. It's unresolved trauma creating delusional pathology in your family. And one, the delusional parent is creating a delusional child. And it's just a nightmare because you're trying to get people to recognize delusions, and they don't. They believe the delusions are true. And as you start to talk with like schizophrenia people and other people, they'll kind of recognize the severity of that and go, "Oh, you got a delusional pathology. Come and join us. It's a family pathology around psychosis." But you're educating NAMI about the pathology in the family courts, and you're enlisting to hopefully their support for families of mental illness, which you qualify for. Um, and so that's my recommendation regarding getting parent support groups over here. But the professionals, real professionals, Tavistock, Peter Fonagy, Bessel van der Kolk, his whole group, I just like real professionals, the Bowen Center, they all need to get back into working with you and working in the family courts. I asked when I was taking a seminar at the Bowen Center, I asked the director of the Bowen Center, why aren't you in the family courts? He says, I don't know. Why don't they listen to you? He says, I don't know. They should listen to family, but they're just not motivated to. And so get Bowen Center back in advising the court and advising, training mental health people, forensic psychologists, court involved clinical psychologists should be trained by Bowen Center for the assessment of persecutory delusions. Do the brief psychiatric rating scale. Get trained by Joseph Venturi. He's down at UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. That's who I worked with for 12 years. He's does the training in BPRS. That's what he does in diagnostic models. Get his training into the mental health people in the family courts. Why isn't the AFCC contracting with UCLA NPI to come out and do a training on the diagnostic assessment of delusional thought disorders at one of their conventions? I don't know. They're just not motivated to learn. So they don't have to come through me. I think it's useful. I know the pathology. Joe doesn't know the pathology in the family courts. I do. But I contacted Joe. I got on sent him an email and met with him because I worked with him for 12 years. And I said, Joe, hi, how you doing? Caught up a little bit. But then I said, I might be sending people in the family courts over to you for training in the BPRS. And so I just wanted to give you a heads up. If people, why are people from the family courts asking me for training in, delusions I said, it's coming out of me. And he said, okay. So, he's got a heads up if the AFCC ever wants to call him, but nobody's motivated to solve anything. That's the fundamental issue. The moment they're motivated to solve it, the moment we return to established knowledge, it's solved immediately. That's the crazy thing about Australia, trying to get parental alienation as child abuse. Stop it. Use a shared persecutory delusion. Boom, you're already at child abuse. It's already in the DSM-5. Or factitious disorder imposed on another. A false attachment pathology imposed on a child. That's also child abuse. So either one of the prime DSM diagnoses wind up with the V code of the child psychological abuse. So I don't know why you're going a different direction. We'll talk a little bit about research before wrapping up here a little bit. We need to get research over here. It is phenomenally shameful that in 40 years there's been no research on the family courts. We need a grant out of Department of Justice to come in and do now. The reason there's no research is because the construct of parental alienation cannot be operationally defined for research purposes. It has the diagnostic criteria do not allow it to be defined. It's too vague. So when I came along, ABPA, that's a diagnostic checklist. It's a perfect operational definition for the pathology. 3 diagnostic indicators, very clear. It's defined through, DSM criteria for narcissistic personality, DSM criteria for uh, specific phobia, and a shared delusion has criteria. So you just identify it. Now you have a definition of the pathology. And so that allows research to actually come in. And oh my goodness, Dorsey Pruder's got wonderful data, uh, emails, texts, everything. And she's done a content analysis, has a software program, and the taggers there. Develop a memorandum of understanding, and you have access to a wealth of information and data surrounding these families. Now, what she currently tags for, or codes is the technical word, data coding. She um, she codes for my 3 diagnostic indicators, 12 associated clinical signs, and they're present. And so that's Greenham, Childress, and Pruder article that'll be coming into the sphere soon. 46 families in the family courts, and the symptoms I identified were present. The 3 diagnostic were present in 46 families, and the 12 associated clinical signs were also present at a high degree in these families. So ABPA is an accurate, true and accurate description of the pathology. That's what the research is going to be coming out saying. But even if you don't agree with me or whatever, and you have some sort of other approach or ideas about the pathology, Dorsey Pruder and the Conscious Co-Parenting Institute can retag their data. They just need the money to do it. So you bring in a research grant and you say, I want to pay your taggers and the Conscious Co-Parenting Institute to retag the data according to this category. So we're going to select 10 families, retag the data on these categories, and see what's up. It's archival data. It flies through an IRB. Just takes an MOU and money to pay for the retagging and to pay for the overhead with Dorsey, but she's got data. And so at this point going forward, there is zero reason for there not to be research coming out of the family courts. There's already research, Greenham, Childress, and Pruder 2023. We've got data, we got research, frequency counts of symptoms in the family. So it's coming. Get some grants in from Justice Department, from people who are concerned about the family courts. We just need to get research in there. What I would recommend to solve a problem, and I'll have to wrap up here, but what I would recommend is a pilot program for the family courts, ABPA and Dorsey High Road program. We can put together, Dr. Childress and Pruder can put together a pilot program for the family courts, and then you layer on university involvement to do the outcome research, and then the university can use that seed of the pilot program to develop the diagnostic assessment protocol and the treatment protocol for the pathology in the family courts, as well as the legal arguments that to support that. So you got a problem. How do you solve it? You bring in your top people at your university to do a pilot program to solve it, to develop the um, assessment protocol, diagnostic assessment, and to develop the treatment protocol. Treatment, you combine up DBT with emotionally focused therapy, and you create the court involved treatment model, and then the diagnostic assessment for persecutory delusions and false attachment pathology. And we can stop the fighting around these children. That's what we need to do. We need to bring the fighting to a close. So let's do that. Let's all find agreement. And the way we find agreement is on the established scientific and professional knowledge of the discipline and on the APA ethics code. We can all agree to those things. So, with that, I'm going to be wrapping up here this morning. Um, Good luck to everybody out there. I will be coming back into public consults starting in March and April, and those are kind of full. I'll open up May soon here, and I'll be traveling over to Serbia in April, late April, early May. because there's movement over there. There's always been some degree of movement. I've kind of kept my eye on it. Eastern Europe, Romania, that domain, Poland, even. There's movement. There's people who want to solve it in the system, who want to solve it, and so it's reached a point where I think my physical presence there can help move things forward. So talking about you and me again, you can see, I'm actually thinking world, global pathology all over the place. It's the same pathology all over the place. And once we solve the systems, that's replicable in everywhere. And so once we solve this pathology, the aspect of it, we solve the pathology for all children and all parents everywhere. And we can stop doing it one case at a time. We develop a systems approach that will solve it and catches it early. We do early intervention, and we get a handle on this pathology. But it takes the motivation of them to solve it. The ones who have the fingers of power, uh, fingers on the buttons of power. It takes their motivation to solve things, and they're not motivated for a variety of reasons. So, with that, happy Sunday to everybody, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.